So, good evening, and welcome to a relatively new tradition within a slightly less new tradition, which is the winter residency of the Trias residency. As you probably know, Peter Trias, a generous alumnus of the college, has made possible a sequence of events and opportunities that have enriched writing and literary life here on campus. Each year, we bring in nationally or internationally known poets and fiction writers to work with students in a year-long residency. This year, our poet is the gifted Mary Ruffel. That writer, in turn, curates a reading series of work which is in conversation with her own. And in addition to that rich program, the directors of the Trias residency also create a shorter series of events in the winter mini residency, often bringing in a fiction writer in a poetry-heavy year, as we have in this case. This week, writer Jess, author of 2 collections of short stories, The Train to Lowoo and Nobody Ever Gets Lost, and a novel called Your Face and Mine, will meet with students, offer tonight's reading, and teach a master class, and that'll be on Wednesday at 12:15 in the Blackwell Room, which I encourage you to attend. On Wednesday night, in the same space, scholar Sonia Posmatier will be giving a talk on Black reading, and next month, Trias will also be welcoming Jen Bervin on March 9th. Jess is a writer who labors over his first drafts, so that where many writers have a process which involves 5, 10, or 20 drafts, Jess is more likely to produce something polished by the time he reaches the last page. I'm sure he'll tell you there's plenty of work to be done still, but already the sentences are clean, precise, and sharp. I think you can hear this in his prose, the way the sentences strike true each time. They're not show-offy, but they are lucid, lovely, and simple. Maybe his decades-long practice of Zen, he started when he was 4, he's now 24. His decades-long practice of Zen is also present in the form of them. Let me give you a few not particularly important or notable sentences from his novel, but still, I think, incredible gems to give you a sense of how he hits true every single time. This is from a chapter ending towards the beginning of the book, which is incidentally on sale right over there. Here we go. He pulls his hood back up, hunches his shoulders, and disappears through the door, back into the tepid weather, the diffident sunshine, the blank, anonymous world that seems to have created him. Here's another one. The brakes failed, or the car hydroplaned, or probably, most likely, both. It crashed through a guardrail, rolled over a narrow strip of grass, and went into the Charles, and they drowned. Here we also have an introduction to 2 of the central conditions of his novel. A grieving widower and father returns to his native Baltimore and there meets a man he knew in adolescence, but much changed. His childhood friend Martin is a white man who has chosen to take on an African-American identity. Emily Raboteau, in her New York Times review of the book, calls this project daring, given our history. Indeed, at a cultural moment in which we are all finally attuned to matters of cultural appropriation, where Beyoncé is claiming of her own Southern identity in her recent video Formation, skates close to exploitation in the eyes of some viewers, and to others performs a vital reclaiming of appropriated imagery, the territory is so complex that students and scholars, thinkers and artists often shy away from the subject altogether. And here are some words that Jess wrote in an essay for Guernica on the subject. He's talking about his debt to the writer James Baldwin. The great body of normative white American fiction published since the 60s finds that Black people, if they appear at all, appear as solemn figures of guilt, suffering, folksy wisdom, or a kind of impossible, wispy redemption. Always on the margins, always disappearing into the wings. This mindset, this is a little later on in the essay, that the best compliment we can pay to Black literature and the Black experience is to ignore it, is rooted in a more fundamental reality of the post-civil rights era. Most white writers, like most white Americans, particularly those over 30, still feel a profound psychic distance between themselves and Black people. And he ends, "My version of another country would have to begin with whiteness, the unnamed, unresolved, guilty whiteness of 90s liberals, hidden under irony and subterfuge, fake dreadlocks, tribal tattoos, unconvincing DJ names. Whiteness was doing everything possible to act as if it no longer mattered." So I think that gives you a sense of the way that Rao works as a writer, writing into territory that I think many of us feel nervous to even have conversation about, much less invest our artistic lives in, produce and publish, and have read and considered by other people. And I think this gives you a sense of why I wanted to bring him to campus and to share his work with you. So please join me in welcoming Jess Rao to campus today.
Thank you everybody for coming. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
We've got a big crowd in the back, clustered around the sofas.
It's warmer if you move up. There's a lot of heat here.
So it's very cold, and you know, when it's this cold, I think our thoughts turn to questions of survival and whether we will survive, or perhaps even would survive in even more difficult conditions. You know, it's sort of a close to the bone time to be alive, February. So I'm going to read the story called The Empties, or not the whole story, but I'm going to sort of read a sort of Cliff Notes version of the story, an excerpted version of the story. I've taken a few pieces out. It's a story about the future, about a sort of nightmare of the future, and it takes place in northern country. So perhaps you'll recognize some of the images and ideas I'm working with here. The Empties. She had never perfected the trick of moistening the envelope flap with the tip of her tongue so that it would stick and lie perfectly flat. In those days, perfect meant as if untouched by hands. Her flaps were always overwet and lumpy. When she pressed them down, she made them worse. Still, she loved folding the paper twice over into 3 equal parts. She loved writing addresses, but especially her name and address in the upper left corner, J. Seiden, 29 Portnock Road. The dignity, the business-like efficiency of those slim objects, asking nothing, never disclosing more than they needed to. An envelope with only a check inside, flapped like a flag, but an envelope containing a 2-page letter had a solid integrity on every plane. A writer only in the sense that she loved having written. She slid the envelopes under the metal lid of the mailbox on her parents' porch and stared at them for a few moments, proof of her existence in the world, proof the world existed. You could count on it. Someone was coming to take them away, proof you would be sent, proof you would arrive. She's sitting with Quentin at the Calf Cafe, set up under an enormous beech tree next to the South Royalton charging tower, a collection of salvaged plastic tables and chairs, and a wheelbarrow cut up and welded into a wood-burning stove. The cafe serves mostly sassafras and stinging nettle tea, but now and again there are red market goods unearthed from a collapsed house or a forgotten box in the pantry, half-rotted Lipton bags or dented cans of Bustelo coffee 2 years past their expiration date. Dory, the owner, is a strict no-currency vor, and you have to know her to get in on the bartering for the really good stuff. But it's worth biking the 7 miles just to bask in the shade of Quentin's unrepentant optimism. Quentin is a resurrectionist, a money hoarder. Before that, before the last supplies ran out, he traded unleaded gas on the red market. He's the last one left in South Royalton with a working laptop, a silver incongruity whenever he takes it from its case and plugs the white cord into the charging tower's collection of rusting cables. 5 minutes of charge just keeps the battery alive. People stare at him until he anxiously gathers the laptop up and slips it away. Not that anyone would steal it, they just don't want to be reminded. "This isn't fucking Starbucks," some crusty vor always mutters. She herself takes a bag of nails everywhere she goes, bound up with fraying rubber bands. Everybody needs nails, and the Rumsons left boxes and boxes of them, sorted by size and type, in the basement. Her basement, though only in the most accidental sense. It was Nathan, her boyfriend, who'd found the house as a caretaker gig on Craigslist. "Anyway," Quentin's saying, "I was down at the Grange listening to these guys arguing about the difference between dystopia and apocalypse. Can you believe that? One of them was saying that we're living in a dystopian novel, and the other guy, this big bearded dude from the West Rats Collective, said, no, dystopia means an imaginary place where everything is exactly wrong, and what we're living in is a post-apocalyptic prelapsarian kind of thing. You know, a return to nature after the collapse of society as we knew it. You want some?" He unscrews a Burt's Bees tin and holds it out to her. Pine sap, milky, resiny, the consistency of caramel. People say it's almost as good as Nicorette. She shakes her head. He scoops some onto his thumbnail. "And anyway," he says, "I must have been 3 or 4 shots in. We were drinking Wayne Peters' sweet potato vodka because I said, look, kiddos, the truth is neither. We have no idea what might happen. The infrastructure is still basically in place, especially if people from certain collectives hadn't stripped out all the copper over in White River. No copper, no charging tower," she says. "But my point is really that dystopian and post-apocalyptic narratives are narratives, that is, stories. Things that are inherently invented or collated ex post facto. Narratives are static. Real life is, kinetic. The point is, we just need to let all that shit go, because call it end times or whatever you want, things are different now. None of the old endings played out, did they? So we have to imagine new endings, hence the possibility for hope." "They must have gone easy on you," she says. "They just started crying. That's the sad thing. Haven't seen so much crying since August of 15. Some people, you get a little liquor in them and it's all about the old times. They just want to huddle up and sing Lady Gaga." The dark is thickening now. Dory clanks her step stool from one low-hanging branch to another, lighting the candles inside each red glass globe. Tomas, the glass blower, held out for almost 2 years, firing the furnace with the last of his stored LPG, then with wood, making thick, indestructible goblets and candle lanterns, heavy and irregular as stones. He'd had exhibits at the Met and the Louvre, had made Christmas ornaments for the White House. Now he's buried under a cairn up on Hull Mountain, dead of spring dysentery. He's right, she's thinking. Quentin's right. We have no story for ourselves. We've outlasted the predictions. We're too boring to be apocalyptic. But what would hope mean after all that's happened? Hope for whom? Quentin's current theory has something to do with Caspar Weinberger, fallout shelters, server farms, and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I'm the town crank, he told her once, swigging from a gallon jug of hard cider on her porch, his face ribboned with tears. If she didn't want to spare his feelings, she would tell him, the way only one liberal arts college graduate can say to another, that the problem isn't narrative, it's theory. The age of sense-making itself has passed. We don't need an analyst, she thinks, or an oracle, God forbid. We need a chronicler, a town recorder, a church Bible full of births and deaths, an inventory with a few highlights, 1 or 2 safety tips, a bit of incidental knowledge for whoever comes along next. But who has the hours to sit parked at a desk, smithing words, when there's 10 pounds of berries in buckets on the porch waiting to be picked over and dried on sheets in the sun? I do. It's nearly September. 2 years ET they've taken to saying, end times, as versus BET, before end times. Most days the cafe is empty, Dory asleep under a canopy stitched together from banner ads she salvaged from the Catamounts baseball field. Petco, Ledyard Bank, Murphy's Ace Lumber, National Life. Work now or starve in March. But she thinks, I've hit the jackpot, haven't I? Only my one mouth to feed, a roof that doesn't leak, 3 cords of seasoned wood in the barn, a stone-solid immune system, and hands striated and shiny with scar tissue, hands that can pluck a boiled mason jar out of a scalding bath, hands no man would ever love. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Here's the thing that happened today, she wrote at the top of every page of a Kelly Green Kate Spade journal those first few weeks after the blackout. It had been a 21st birthday gift, too pretty to throw away, though she rarely wrote anything by hand, so it had stayed at the bottom of one closet after another for 15 years. Once her laptop went dead, she unearthed it and afterward kept it under her shirt at all times in a special sling made of two Eat More Kale t-shirts sewn together. Here's the thing that happened today. It was the only possible way to begin when the last of the cell towers stopped working. Spoke to Mom in California, she wrote, should have tried again. Russell Tyson had his pickup parked on the town green with 3 generators running in the back, and people were paying $20 for 10 minutes of battery life, coaxing their phones back to a single bar, running fingers through their newly matted hair. A few days later, the gravel around the green was littered with shards of thin, luminous glass, shattered smartphone screens, as disposable now as crack vials had been on North Avenue back in high school. In those dirty days, she thinks, we were all resurrectionists. Even the most dyed-in-the-wool vegan bicyclists still had tumblers to update, still needed ice in their fair trade coffee on an August afternoon, and a monthly refill of Ritalin in a stapled paper bag from the Rite Aid in Norwich. What was it like to spend every moment a little on edge, thinking that any time now the radio would beep, the air conditioner begin to whir, the lights flood the sullen, filthy rooms? What it was like, as a practical matter, was stinky. No one wanted to admit that they needed to take a bath in the creek. No one wanted to volunteer to build a town latrine. No one knew how to build a latrine. After the 3rd week, people pissed and shat by the side of the road in the open. It was Elizabethan, and left little white flags of TP everywhere you looked. That was the worst of it, the weeks of withdrawal when the coffee had run out, then the tea, the cigarettes, the Adderall, the Wellbutrin, the Ativan, the Paxil, the Zoloft. Here's the thing that happened today. She did a tally and counted 23 suicides. People disappeared into the woods carrying knives, plastic bags, rubber bands, or jumped off the White River Bridge on I-91. It was September, Indian summer, the leaves flaming out, the first nippy nights. The commuters, the office workers, the secretaries and actuaries and lawyers walked around the town green in a daze, waiting for a sign. Excuse me. The farmers were all hard at work, running out the last diesel in their tractors. Some kids moved into the United Church and hung out a banner, Occupy Blackout. There was a girl, she remembers, who went up on the grassy hillside beside the Montessori school with a basket of scraps and a pair of scissors and began recreating her Pinterest page, squares of bright cloth for each JPEG, strips of blue sheet for the toolbar and browser frame. One night at the beginning of that first winter, it must have been early in December, Nathan outlaying the useless snares he'd built from an illustration in the homesteader's manual. She panicked when the fire wouldn't start in the kitchen stove and tore out pages in the journal, 2 or 3 at a time, as tinder. The living room shelves sagged with books she could have used for the same purpose. The Road Less Traveled, Italy on $5 a day. But at that moment, she thinks, forgiving herself, no one would have wanted to move a single extra muscle. In the winter, when you're cold, the world extends no more than a foot in any direction. Anyway, she thinks, no one cares about that stuff. The cheap pathos of children losing their toys, not about the old dead life, only about the life that took its place. She finds Matilda Barnstone in her rocking chair on the library porch, smoking a pipe, her sawed-off shotgun, resting comfortably across the floral sprigs of her lap. The library is the only building left in town with a working lock, chicken wire nailed across the windows. People might share their last finger of motor oil, Matilda says. Break a 4-inch candle in 2, divide a pot of beans to serve 8, but they'll kill you for a book. She sleeps in the basement with a Glock under her pillow. No lending anymore. All books stay on the premises, which means an old schoolhouse groaning on its joists. 2 floors, people in every nook, sweating, stinking, swatting flies, licking their thumbs as they page through Maeve Binchy and C.P. Snow, Louis L'Amour and George Santayana. Everyone gets patted down before leaving. Matilda blows out a blue cloud of corn silk smoke and says, "Haven't seen you in an age. Still working through the stash at the Rumsons?" "I never thought I'd get into Trollope," she says. "I've read 10 so far." "Beats Tom Clancy. We take donations, you know. Once I get someone to lend me a horse and some saddlebags." "Listen," she says, "Matilda, there's a typewriter in the back office, right?" "Was last I checked." "Is there paper for it? Ribbons?" Matilda regards her with a faint smile. "I'm working on a town history," she says. "August of 15 to the present. A record. There ought to be a record. An oral history." "Not quite, just a record written by me." "Who's going to read it?" "Why," she says, "it'll stay here in the library for the next generation, for history." "Did I hear right?" Matilda says. "Did I hear you say the next generation?" I never took you for a resurrectionist. She sits up straight in her chair. There is no history, she says. That's over now. No writing, only reading. But we have a story too. We had a story. She rocks vigorously. Now we're just poor, she says. Outside time. Lumpen proletariat, the subaltern, outside history. And let's hope history never finds us again. We'll be squashed like bugs on a windshield. Then a thought seems to strike her. Stay here for a moment, she says. She shoulders the sawed-off and disappears inside. Carter, she hears Matilda bellowing, no pissing out the window, please. Use the latrine. Matilda reappears with a thick padded envelope. Here, she says. Inside there's a stapled stack of white paper, a manuscript. Shroud of the Hills, a novel by Matilda E. Barnstone, copyright 2003. Send it to some contests, Matilda says. Few agents, 1 or 2 MFA programs, no bites, no notice. Kept getting afraid someone would steal my ideas. Anyway, you can use it. Use it how? Turn it over, dimwit. Use the back. That's 332 pages of blank paper. You don't have another copy? What would I need it for? Leave it in the library and eventually some poor unfortunate soul would read the thing. Got pens? Whole box of ballpoints. Haven't hardly used them since. Make me look good, Matilda says. That's all I can say. At home, later, after she's weeded the tomatoes, harvested the last of the string beans, hauled a load of wash down to the stream and spread it over the long grass, she sits on the porch with a jar of cold well water and begins. Before the last blackout, the power had been on and off for weeks. I came up to Burlington in 2007 after a bad breakup in Brooklyn. It wasn't until Brian Sterling died in February the first winter that we knew we were doing it wrong. All that paper, glorious and terrifying. She riffles the stack through her fingers. She wonders where her laptop is, heaped in the back of a closet somewhere upstairs, with all the other dead things they weren't able to cannibalize, the surge protectors and headphones, Nathan's guitar amp, their digital cameras and printers, iPods, iPads, the Tivoli stereo receiver, and Harman Kardon speakers. Before end time, she'd never written anything on paper longer than a single sheet. Even when she kept a journal, her hand cramped up. In college, her writing tutor told her not to think essay, not even to think paragraph. Just think in thought bubbles like comic strips and type them in big letters, hitting print, print, print every time, and then spread them out across the floor and let the essay appear. God, she says out loud, not for the first or thousandth time, the way we built everything on waste. Now she feels she couldn't afford a single wasted sheet. It ought to just come to her, not because she's such a genius, because she's the only one, the only scribe, the voice of the people, the living and the dead. For the first few months, before November came and the snow started, you'd still have people rumbling into town in cars, pickups, motorcycles, especially motorcycles, because a gallon of gas went so much farther that way. One of the occupiers would climb up and clang the church bell with a hammer, bringing people running from every direction, skidding their bikes, banging strollers along the rutted sidewalks. "Mic check," would come the cry, and then the waves of news in little sentence bundles, tweets amplified in waves throughout the crowd. Manhattan is almost empty, there are rats running down Broadway. Police station torched in Hartford, all the riot gear was stolen. FEMA set up these orange tents in Springfield and disappeared. I've got 3 bottles of iodine here, 1 drop for a gallon of water should be enough. Look out for a woman with a beetle tattooed on her wrist. I'm a doctor. If you have spare antibiotics, anything, empty your medicine cabinets. It was also random. You might hear 5 tendrils of the same rumor in a week, each canceling out the last, and it was almost a relief when the cars and motorcycles stopped coming. People who lived out near the highway still reported seeing vehicles flashing by every now and again, but it was 1 a day at most. There was talk of throwing up a checkpoint, a barrier, of collecting tax in some form. But once December started, no one had time to think about it. All you heard was the smack of axe on wood. What did people do, she thought, in the places where the old houses had been torn down long ago, where the split-level ranches had baseboard heat, and there wasn't a wood stove to be hauled at 50 miles? Thank God for Vermont and its fucking, quote, rustic, unquote, charm, Nathan used to say. Each house had a chimney, some 2. Families moved in together that winter. Couples learned to grapple in a twin bed or a single sleeping bag. She and Nathan piled up all the comforters in the house, every Boba Fett blanket from the Romson's kids' rooms, even the decorative handmade quilts from Mississippi that lined the second-floor hallway. It took her breath away, sliding in under 20 pounds of thread and batting, but then she curled up against his shoulder blades, letting him take the weight. She'd never been much for spooning before, but it was a month for counting all your advantages. George Larson converted his barn into a smokehouse and slaughtered every last alpaca, llama, and goat on his property, accepting the 3 best milkers and $1, walking the piles of smoked meat through town in a wheelbarrow, taking anything he could get as barter. Family portraits, Rambo knives, bales of cloth diapers, canned peas, stacks of old Rolling Stones. In the spring, there were no reports of cars anywhere. She wonders what it would be like to see one again. After nearly 2 years, a car that moved, not a rusting carapace on blocks. Her own car, a '99 Subaru, she traded to Dwight Yardley. He made it into a spare chicken coop. It was one of those tidbits you picked up in middle school history. The Middle Ages ended when trade began, when roads were built or rebuilt, the Roman roads, because merchants carried first-hand accounts from town to town, hamlet to castle. Before end time, she had never made the connection between movement and the news, between cars and information, but how she loved the drive to Brattleboro back when she was temping at Drive-Ins Parker 3 days a week, and the richness of the FM signal that boomed through the car. You're listening to All Things Considered. I'm Robert Siegel, and I'm Michelle Norris. In Syria today, government reprisals claim more victims, but first we're going to go to Botswana for a report on a new way to treat waterborne parasites. It was one of the great pleasures of that age to be safe and warm and dry, showered, deodorized, professionally clothed in espadrilles and a linen jacket, latte steaming up the radio display, taking in the world's troubles 3 minutes at a time. That was luxury. Dwight Yardley finds her asleep on the porch the next morning in the hammock he built for her, the manuscript pages held down by a smooth river stone. Guess that's why they call it a sleeping porch, she says, setting down the milk crate with a solid clump. Protein, she thinks, swimming out of her dream. Protein has arrived. Didn't think you'd get here this early. It's high summer now, he says. Gotta be up with the rooster, then sleep through siesta. World doesn't stop heating up just because we're unplugged. Hotter every year since I can remember. They've had the same conversation 100 times. Dwight is not imaginative in his ways, thank God. Eggs this week, he says. Netted some crappie and smoked those. Mushrooms. Threw some more jerky in there, too. Know you're sick of it, but still. Moose are scarce now, is what he's saying, and wickedly labor-intensive. She's never been on one of those group hunts, but Quentin went once with 5 other guys. Too big to be hauled away by anything smaller than a pickup, a moose has to be field butchered, apportioned to the team where it falls. In practice, Quentin says, this means standing around in an inch of blood-soaked snow like something at a Fargo, working frantically to beat nightfall. He sharpened knives all day, that was his job, wiping them against his pants and scrubbing them against the whetstone. For dinner they roasted the heart, it was enough to feed all 6 of them. Then they hauled out the whole bloody mess, wrapped up and lashed in tarps to the saddles of their horses. It was like Cormac McCarthy, Quentin says, crossed with Clan of the Cave Bear. But you did it, she said, you played your part. Didn't that make you want to cross over and become a vor even for a second? And he said, are you fucking kidding me? I had nightmares for a week. Eating moose still makes me queasy. We've advanced since the Pleistocene, that's the whole point. Your appointment's this week, she tells Dwight. Want to come inside? Can't we do it out here? In the hammock? Only if you want to fix it afterward. He grins at her. I was thinking of you leaning on the rail, he says. Got to looking at some of my old magazines. Oh, Dwight, you know I'm shy. No one's around to see. Being so early, it takes her a while to get him going. She has some massaging and cooing to do, even puts him in her mouth for a minute. But in the end, with her skirt hiked up over her hips, elbows digging into the flaking paint, he's done before the 3rd grunt. Sorry, he says, pulling up his Carhartts. That's no way for a gentleman to behave. We can go again if you like, she says, spreading her knees and wiping unashamedly with her bandana. I didn't even get out the egg timer. Don't tease. You know I'm good for 1 a day, if that. Bet you tell that to all the girls. She wonders how many there really are. The thing about arrangements is everybody has one, but nobody wants to talk about it. That's what Quentin says. There's no transparency in informal economies. She remembers what it was like, the transparent world. Walking into a 7-Eleven and looking down the row of coolers, all that glass, all that pure water. Had a vasectomy some years back, Dwight said. The first and only time they talk terms, so nothing to worry about on that score. Plus, it's only been me and Angela. How was she to know that she wouldn't be puking in a month, heavy with another Yardley in the spring, by demanding his medical records, asking him to go to Rite Aid and get a pack of Trojans? She writes, "We used to say oppression only when we talked about the government. Having to survive is also oppression. Necessity is oppression. Dignity is for people who have options. We were working so hard to get back to the land, then the land got us back and won't let go. I would give anything to drink coffee out of a styrofoam cup," she writes. "Instant coffee with powdered creamer, the kind they gave out for free, the kind they gave out for free at car dealerships and funeral homes. I would give anything to throw something away and never see it again. I think about taking out the trash the way we used to at home, rolling it out to the curb, the trucks passing while we were at school. We are our garbage," Mom always used to say. That was her mantra, and I guess she was right in her way. In the first couple of weeks, there were big piles of trash outside every house, all the stuff you couldn't find another use for and couldn't compost. Yogurt cups, torn trash bags, dirty diapers, hairspray cans, paper towels. Sometimes you'd see a pile that was as high as your waist. Nathan said it was a purge, a cleanse, but you could just as well say that who we were went out with the empties. We will never get ourselves back. In those days, all the terms we had were metaphors. A desktop wasn't a desktop, mail wasn't mail, dial didn't mean to use a dial, ringtones didn't actually ring. In the winter, she dreams of forced air heating, the whoosh of the furnace starting up, the rush through the vents, the toasty smell of radiators. And in the summer, she dreams of AC, the blast of frigid air in your face when you turn the key in the car, the cool seeping through a new condo with central air and wall-to-wall ecru carpets, even the oily dampness of an old window unit in an apartment on 2nd Avenue with sheets over the windows. And then she thinks, that was the government, that was America, air conditioning of the mind. We found that out, didn't we? Bob Pearl, the Royalton postmaster, hung around the town green in an orange FEMA vest for weeks after the first blackout, showing everyone a thick binder labeled Disaster Response in Rural Communities. It said that the National Guard would be there within 24 hours. There were pictures of tanker trucks, rows of trailers, pallets of MREs. This isn't science fiction, Quentin says, because if it were, we'd have the answers. We'd know what happened. Okay, so I'm going to skip toward the end, and what happens here is a man shows up who's not from there and says that he has escaped from Connecticut and that he ran into a convoy of military vehicles on Interstate 91 headed north, and he basically tells this community that there's a convoy of people from a reformed American government. There's an army coming to retake the uncivilized zones of Vermont that have still not been reclaimed by the central government. He warns them to basically take shelter. He says, hide, go to ground, be like the Vietnamese. This is a bunch of crap, Dory says, but she's anxious, chomping at a stalk of ryegrass and twisting it around with her index finger. It's psyop, she says. Bet you anything there's a war party coming up from White River Junction ready to steal our shit while we go hide in the bushes. They're standing around the Calf Cafe mostly, some collapsed into chairs, a core of 20 or so. Dwight's there, and Quentin. Matilda sits sunken in a chair, her head in her hands. Oh, Jesus, Quentin says. Stop being such a vor for a moment and admit you might be wrong. This guy's ID says Connecticut. Look, you seriously thought Washington was just gonna, disappear? He's trembling, she realizes. He can't keep his knees in place. His downy calves, his clean socks inside ancient, battered Doc Martens, an indefatigable doer of laundry with a livid scar that runs the length of one forearm from the first time he tried skimming the bubbling fat, making his own soap. There are people who would bear anything, she thinks, to swipe a credit card again, to buy cut flowers, to see the straight furrows in a newly vacuumed carpet. You can't have everyone mourning quietly on a small farm. Someone has to turn a shining face to the resurrection to translate loss into profit. That's how we got cotton gins and B-52s and Tide. Look, Matilda says, one thing we know, someone's coming. We haven't seen the end of this. I'm proposing we arm ourselves and stay together. Who's with me? Me. She raises her hand as if to say not, I agree, but present. This isn't the way the story ends, she tells herself, pedaling furiously over the last knobby hill before the Rumsons' driveway. We're not like Ewoks, rolling them over with logs, trapezing the soldiers out of their turrets on vines, huddling in tree houses, or like the Kong, trapping them in shit-smeared punji pits, feeding the prisoners to rats. This isn't Star Wars, and it isn't The Deer Hunter, and it isn't Independence Day. We've got no reason to believe this guy. We've got crops to bring in, tomatoes getting soft on the vine, and we're wasting time acting out Red Dawn. But she'll cycle back with the gun because she knows she doesn't want to be alone. Mr. Rumson, who seemed like such a nice man, a mild-mannered professor of something, who evidently didn't believe in sunscreen the way his nose peeled. She'd met him the one time she picked up the key. He'd left the place well-armed, nonetheless. A whole cabinet of guns, unlocked up in his study in the attic. She keeps a revolver lying next to her on the bed upstairs, and because Dwight insists, a shotgun in the corner just inside the front door. If a deer comes across the lawn, he says, don't think twice, aim for the head, and don't worry about the butchering, I'll hear the shot. That's a year's supply of meat for one skinny thing like you. The gun she wants now is the scary one, with the folding stock and the banana clip. How does she even know these words? It's surprisingly light when she lifts it up by the strap. The clip slides in and locks just like plugging a battery into a camera. It's idiot-proof. She writes at the table on the porch, the assault rifle laid out just within reach. Brian was the first person I'd ever seen die, and it was my fault, or at least I contributed. I mean, I didn't get him sick, but Nathan said not to leave the fire burning so high with the windows closed. I got better at it after that. For a while, we were serving as the hospital, 11 or 12 patients at a time. There was no reason not to. We had all these big empty rooms downstairs and a good supply of wood, 2 stoves. Maxine was an herbalist and a Reiki healer and a PA, too. She stayed here 3 months directing things. That was the best of it. Then she came down with it, and Nathan and I were left handling things on our own. Dwight brought food when he could and took the bodies out, but that was before the last blizzard, the March blizzard. After Brian, I got impatient with them as they died, knowing that by the time the lips started turning blue, there was no stopping it. Hurry up, I used to think, free up the bed. By the time it was Nathan's turn, I was just sloppy, forgetting to bring him water for hours, things like that. I was never cut out to be a nurse. There was snowbank halfway up to the downstairs windows. Where was I supposed to put the bodies? I laughed at him. I laughed at Nathan when he begged me for things. He was delusional at the end, begging for Klondike bars. I was never meant to have children. I never wanted to. This isn't our story. There was supposed to be time to tell our story. I was a decent person. I went to good schools. In my own time, I would have been a good person. You can't judge the people on the lifeboats, the crashed soccer players, and the stupid Andes. This is the last time a person will be one person. What do I mean? I mean a woman living in a house alone. Dwight offered to have me stay with them the second winter, and I said, no, I'll cut my own wood. No one stays with me this time. I'll stock up properly. I'm immune now. I guess so. This is the last time. I don't know how to write without drafts. I don't know how to write a declarative sentence. Fuck it. I don't know how to declare anything at all. A boil of black smoke rises off the ridge opposite her. The McNeils. What could they have out there? A forgotten oil drum? A pile of tires? Are they fighting already? Is it the army? The people from White River? A grinding sound, a whining sound, machinery. Is that what it is? It's been 2 years. She can't be sure. And then trickling through the air, a sick Morse code, a demented tap dancer, gunshots. This is it, she thinks. Not the end times, the time of the end. What makes her so certain? I've been intimate with death, she thinks. That's how I know. I can smell it, even on myself. She picks up the manuscript, 15 pages, scrawl, notes, hesitations. Matilda was right, she says to herself. We're not the beginning of anything. We're about to be pulped right back into the ground. We're about to re-enter history. We were good people, she writes. We made it work. We weren't sad. We were proud. We didn't need an ending. We were too grateful. Living was enough. A flicker of wind, a sudden gust across the yard takes the pages out of her hand. She doesn't even have to toss them. White flags across the garden, perfect rectangles, perfect things, falling lightly on the gravel, resting in the tall grass. That's done, she says. She picks up the rifle and lays it across her knees. Thank you.
How do you balance making your point and the clarity of your project to hold up that mirror with the robustness and the believability of the world that you're making? Do you err on the side of one or the other?
Say that again?
If you're trying to hold up a mirror to our current culture from this future perspective, do you focus on the clarity of that mirror and making your point known, or the robustness of the fictional world that you're making?
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, now that I hear the question. So when I first started writing a story, it was for fun. It was basically to make fun of Vermont. And, just to write something funny about, like, ha ha ha, Vermont after the apocalypse, and, like people missing their organic coffee and their, Tumblr pages. And, and so that was the way I got into it. And then I realized at a certain point that the story that I was creating, I was actually sort of buying the story. And then I sent it to the New Yorker, and the New Yorker accepted it, and the editor basically said, like, you have to make this story much more believable. So, or you have to make this story much more sort of consistent, so the, like, kind of apocalypse action movie stuff at the end, she wanted that to have more of a through line. And at first I thought, that's just silly. But then I thought, okay, so let's do exactly what you're talking about. Let's take a little further the tension between the sort of satire part and the actual, the sort of exciting, this post-apocalyptic part. And it sort of went farther in that direction than I thought I was ever going to go. But it's sort of, it's sort of fun to write that stuff too. So, and it ended up being enjoyable, even though it wasn't what I intended. The story gets less and less funny and less satirical as it goes on. Other questions? You guys all gonna go home and like load up the extra supplies and the shotgun.
Were you thinking about Bernie Sanders, by the way?
Was I thinking about Bernie Sanders?
I mean, kind of,
No. Not really, no. Although, you would think, he's sort of a good post-apocalyptic senator that they would put in it, because he's so sort of down to earth, and, he's from Vermont, like he knows how to like fix a boiler, and, there was another hand up in the, yeah.
So I was wondering about where the whole perspective of like the writer in the future, like the writer's place, and how like the only thing that really matters is just like factual stuff. I was wondering, like, when did that sort of enter into your context?
The idea of like the writer in the future, pretty early on, because I was writing this story as part of a collection of stories that's all metafictional in some way or another. So I knew that I knew that the story was going to have a kind of a metafictional angle, that it was going to be about a story about stories of the apocalypse. And the idea of the main character as being sort of a failed writer came in pretty early. I was thinking about the way that, in our culture, writing is something that is very accessible. Everybody's got a laptop, it's like the tools of writing, and also, creative writing is a very widespread thing. There's MFA programs everywhere, so there's this very widespread culture of writing, which is terrific. But there's also something, it's expressive of our culture that people have enough free time to do that. And in a survival-based culture, a culture that's living very much at the edge, you have this question about, traditionally we think of those kinds of post-apocalyptic stories, and people are always cannibalizing each other and, sort of driving, doing like Mad Max things, and there's no novelists in Mad Max, but if there were any kind of like apocalyptic event, there would still be free time, there would still be downtime. So I wanted this to be a kind of a boring apocalypse, and have at least enough space for that, even though she doesn't feel, she's questioning, what is the role of the writer in this circumstance. But I wanted this to be like an apocalypse where people are just sitting around, the way that people did before television and the internet, and they're they're returned to this traditional sense of actually having a lot of empty time or free time. So they're all crowded in the library, reading anything they can get their hands on. Other questions? Yeah.
So, a lot of my fiction writing friends say that you have to write, or many of them have written like 2 novels before they write the novel that's the first novel that they have published, or say you have to write 1,000 pages before you can write your good page. And I'm wondering if your process is such that you, by the time you finish, as Melanie said in the introduction, by the time you finish, by the time you get to the end of it, you've kind of re-edited everything as you go along. Does that hold true for you? Is that something that you have to throw away a bunch of short stories before you wrote one you were happy with? Or?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah, definitely. Like a whole. Not only I had to throw away not only individual stories, but a whole approach to writing short stories before I could write anything worthwhile. So it was like I had another whole writing life where I was being very imitative and trying to sort of write a lot about. Like when I was in college, when I was your guys' age, when I was in my very early 20s, all my stories were sort of about 40-year-old divorced men, like divorced alcoholic men, because I was reading a lot of like Raymond Carver and stuff like that. So I was in this sort of like middle-aged drag, this like middle-aged like guys in Montana, this driving around in like old Fords and smoking and acting like Sam Shepard, and I had to I took that style very, very seriously. And then at a certain point, I just sort of realized, without laughing at myself, I realized that I was just I just couldn't do that. And so it's not just that I had to throw away all the material, but I had to throw away that whole persona and just sort of start from scratch, because I had so effectively rendered, sort of painted myself into an artistic corner in that way. Because I was not good at the smoking and drinking. I sort of failed early at smoking, drinking, and driving around in old cars. And it's like you have to get in the door. Like that's the SAT for being that kind of writer. Is like, can you like down a 5th of whiskey, in a night and live until the day? And I just, that wasn't me. So, I was out. I was out of that camp. But, yeah. No.
Speaking of drinking things, I know that caffeine was part of your thinking about this story.
Yeah.
So I remember talking to you about it when you were in the process of composing it.
Yeah.
So there's the cafe. So why did caffeine or the cafe end up having a centrality to the story?
Well, caffeine is the one thing. If there were an event like this in the Northern Hemisphere, there's no indigenous source of caffeine in the Northern Hemisphere. So the one thing, you can make alcohol out of virtually anything, but you can't have caffeine. And civilization as we know it didn't exist without caffeine. Caffeine, the introduction of coffee and tea into Europe created the Enlightenment, basically. Like people were, it's no accident, And so without it, like our civilization would be fundamentally altered. And I also think people would just go crazy, no source of caffeine. So it's fascinating to me. And then antidepressants too. So it was once I started like thinking through, the apocalypse and like what would, because Vermont, the joke about Vermont is that it's not really a joke, but like Vermont, they make everything there, and there's pottery, and there's, local milk, and it's like the local ore capital of the world. But you can't make indigenous, like they have maple syrup and all this stuff. You can have sugar, you can have everything. All the food groups, sugar, bacon, alcohol, hard cider, but you can, whiskey, but you can't, there's no indigenous stimulant. It's not caffeine, there's no stimulant. So everybody would be sleepy. And so you have to imagine that, Like the European explorers, of course, came with stimulants to the New World. So there would, the idea of a sleepy white culture, it just doesn't exist. So there would be this whole, yeah.
Would you go on like a coffee bender for like 3 weeks and just cut yourself off to try and get into the mind state?
You could try to do that, yes. Or try to, just try to live like a whole, just see if you could. I mean, how many writers are there, or artists, or people, productive people who don't have any stimulant, of some kind? Any other questions? Yeah.
I particularly properly chastised in some ways.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what you expected the reaction of your audiences to be when you read this piece.
It's a good question. I mean, I think that, we recognize that, or maybe we don't recognize how wasteful a culture we are, but it's, if you stop and think about it, we waste, we have so much waste. And, and we think a lot, and waste is so much an expression of our, of our culture. The way that cultures waste not only physical things, but also time and energy. There's a whole sort of philosophical field around thinking about waste and excess and all those things. And I was just thinking about like that idea of like, thinking that you can just like hit print and like print out one piece of paper after another, or that you can like drink one styrofoam cup of coffee after another, and just the unconsciousness with which we live that process, and the way in which that that is like such a expression, and of course those artifacts will be like the little Keurig cups, little K cups, will be in landfills, thousands and thousands of years after we are gone. So there's this way in which more than any other monument, the huge mounds of trash are sort of unexpressed. So it's to me it's a very potent metaphor. It's not meant to shame us. The shame that we feel around garbage is sort of part of the problem in a way, I think, because the shame response is the response to try to hide it, and the fact that we try to hide our waste is actually part of the problem with it, because if you hide it, that means you can forget about it, and if you can forget about it, you don't feel like you have to change. Yeah.
So as you put all of your focus and energy into writing one short story, and then you end up making a collection of short stories, do you ever find that you're making sort of like a line through sort of a common theme, or like a, something that's centralized, whether it's subconsciously or like an effort to do that?
Yeah, I always do. I've written 3 short story collections, and the first one was all centered around Hong Kong, where I was living at the time. And the second one was sort of all centered around September 11th. And the third one, as I was saying, it's called Story Knife, and it's all about sort of how stories work and about metafiction. So when I construct a book of stories, it's always thematic in some way. And I have that, I've been working on a novel, so I don't know a lot of new stories, but I have this one story that I'm working on now that's about teenagers who do pornography involving robotics. Like high school robotics. They make their robots have sex, and they put it online. And so I'm wondering, and this is I'm thinking if this turns into a collection of stories, what's the through line of the collection? I'm not going to write the robot sex story, is that going to be me, Mr. Robot Sex? So I haven't finished the story yet, so maybe something else will appear. But that's where it is. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I read Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11.
Yeah.
The title of that is Survival is Insufficient.
Yeah, right.
And one of the last lines in the story that you read was, living was enough. Do you think it's more interesting to explore the 2 extremes or the middle ground?
The middle between what and what?
The, survival is insufficient and living is enough.
Yeah, well, it's, that's a really interesting way of putting it. Emily's novel came out at exactly the same time that this story came out. And I've always wanted to sort of sit down with her. I know she read it because she told me she liked it. And I've always wanted to sit down with her and say let's do a kind of compare and contrast about the world, the apocalyptic world in which there's Shakespeare, and the apocalyptic world in which people are falling asleep and nobody can finish a coherent paragraph. I think that Station 11 is she took that concept just so as far as it could possibly go. And I love this story, but that novel is on a, she took that She took the sort of idea of the post-apocalyptic world in which there is a surviving culture. She just made that flower in a whole different way. So the book is called Station 11. It's a really amazing novel. I very heartily recommend it. Yeah. There was another question. Yeah.
Could you talk to me about your choice in cultural reference and when you choose to employ some other form of fiction? When you talk about movies or books, anything, I feel like sorry, just go ahead.
You feel like what? Finish.
It's like sometimes it's really effective for me. I notice sometimes only one older side of the room got the cultural reference.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the risk of making any cultural reference at all.
Right.
It's a tricky thing because I'm making cultural reference that worked for me. That express my, that sort of express my feeling for whatever the situation is. But they do date. They get old very quickly. And so you have to be careful about that stuff. There was a time when I was a writer and I thought you should strip out all the cultural references and make your fiction sort of timeless. Because I was really in love with some writers who I thought were doing that. Sort of like Kafka does that. Haruki Murakami sort of does that a lot. He sort of very intentionally strips out all the Japanese-ness from his novels so that they can translate into any context. But the thing is I started thinking about Ulysses, about the novel Ulysses, which, Joyce was writing it long after the period, or decades after the period in which it's set. And, he actually got the telephone book from that particular year in Dublin in order to make all the cultural references exactly dated to that moment. And, it's, on the one hand, to read Ulysses now, if you want to get the cultural reference, you need to have one of those guidebooks to the novel, because there's just so many of them and they're so dense. But on the other hand, he was trying to sort of make the novel a kind of a time capsule of a particular moment, a particular way of living in the world. And I think that's, if you're going to use cultural reference, ultimately that's what you're doing. You're speaking to what some writers have called the secret history of our life and times, or the way we live now. That's Trias' phrase. And, I'm really interested in that. So, that's a risk I'm willing to take. But it's true, how many of you have seen Red Dawn, for example? All right, so, okay. I don't recommend it. You should know what it is. You can watch the last 5 minutes. It was paid for by the CIA. It's actually a propaganda movie, which is really the only interesting thing about it is that that's the movie that the CIA thought was worth paying for in 1983. That was their big thing. Now it just inspires militia movements. Maybe that was what they had done. Any other questions? Yeah.
So it mentioned once or twice that this isn't science fiction. If it were science fiction, you have the answers. Right. And then you put a lot of
and yet here it is in best American science fiction.
But you put a lot of ambiguity about the sickness and the blackout. Was that intentional? Because they always say they don't have the answers, so they don't really talk about what happened.
Yeah. Well, they don't know what caused the blackout, and I think there's a way in which they feel probably because they live in a culture like our culture where if we hear about some symptom, we just whip out our phones and look it up. So there's not having that sort of instant knowledge. I think they have the sense of having just lost and not having NPR, not having CNN. They've lost the ability to define the world on their own terms. The previous generations sort of carried with them. When the Puritans came to New England, they didn't need Wikipedia to define the world they were creating. It was all essentially it was just all contained in their minds and their education. But we don't memorize anymore. We don't educate for completeness and encyclopedic knowledge the way the previous generations did. So I think left with no devices, we would have no device, we would have like no way of defining a narrative. I think that's what's going on in the story. Any other questions? All right, thank you all for coming. Stay warm.